Race the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more to reach the professionals who are more likely to find your ad relevant. Plus, with 1 billion members on LinkedIn, that means you'll have access to 130 million decision makers and 10 million C-level executives. That's a lot of millions of the right people. Get started today and see how you can reach the right buyers with LinkedIn's enhanced targeting tools. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Go to linkedin.com/MPN to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/MPN. linkedin.com/MPN. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey there, communicators and marketers. Let me ask, how confident are you that your content actually connects in every market? If you're guessing, it might be time to check out Phrase. Phrase is the industry-leading AI localization platform that helps you deliver content in multiple languages without losing your tone, your message, or your mind. It automates the manual work, slashes review time, and gives you real data on what's working where. Brands like Uber and Zendesk trust Phrase to scale their content across the globe and get it right every time. If you're serious about reaching more people and driving better results internationally, head over to phrase.com/MPN and take a look. That's phrase.com/MPN. Welcome back to the Trending Communicator. I'm your host, Dan Nestle. This morning, on the day of this recording, I got into a heated comment discussion on LinkedIn about the value of AI content. So I'm sure you can picture it and even predict how it went, but I'll give you a quick summary. The original post, something like, "Only humans should write. AI sucks. It's insulting." Then like the first 15 commenters said, yeah, here, yeah, down with AI. AI sucks. Terrible. Watch out for those M dashes. I love M dashes, by the way. You'll have to pry them out of my cold, dead hands. And then I chimed in and I said, what are you talking about? AI is brilliant. Humans are brilliant. Let's have both. As long as the AI assists the writer, it's all good. Now, it might surprise you that the later commenters missed my point entirely, which was, if the human is at the center, if the ideas are human, and the human understands how to work with AI, then bad ideas notwithstanding, the content can be spectacular. I'm subjecting you to all this nonsense because whether we're talking about AI or any technology, trend, practice, etc., the human is at the center. The human should always be at the center. And we can't possibly be expected to put the human first if our values and behaviors aren't human-centric to begin with. How do we get there? How do we ensure that our values are human-centric? My guest today may have a few things to say about that. For over 2 decades, she has partnered with senior executives on enterprise organizational change, fostering purpose and value-driven cultures, building high-performing teams, and designing employee engagement strategies. She's a trusted advisor to nonprofits and Fortune 100 companies alike. She got her start in PR at Burson Marsteller, progressed to the CCO position at Atlantic Philanthropies, transitioned to a partner at Mercer Consulting, and then change management at Weber Shandwick. And ultimately, she took the role of CEO at United Minds, a part of the Weber Shandwick Collective. Please join me in welcoming to the show a trending communicator, if there ever was one, the amazing Kate Bullinger. Kate, how are you?
I'm well, Dan. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, man. You know, listeners don't know all the machinations that happen in the background, you know, as I put these things together laboriously with my blood and sweat and tears. And, you know, that my intro was a little scripted. It always is. And I'm going to have to go back and change it and do it again because I wasn't happy with it. By the time you hear this, you're not going to know. But just full disclosure, you know, I was watching Kate's face and I saw a couple things didn't land. So I'm going to do that again. But anyway, I really appreciate Kate being here. I know, like, as a CEO of United Minds, I mean, especially these days where we're talking about so much disruption in the workplace, in the communication space, and you being basically right at the center of a lot of it, at Weber. At United Minds, within the Weber universe. I can imagine that you have your share of action, and taking even a little bit of time to come and talk to little me is a huge commitment. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. But I want to hear all about what you're seeing about, transformation and change. And, I talked about AI in the intro. AI always comes up in our conversations. I'm sure it will. But you're really focused, and you've always been focused, at least for the last few decades, on this idea of human centricity. So I'm going to just start there and kind of put it out here to you. Like, my intro is just sort of an offshoot of a human-centric story, just to get at that. But how do you see human centricity? What is it all about? How can we start that kind of discussion? Where's the right place to start the discussion about human centricity within the world of comms and transformation?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, United Minds, we really focus on business transformation and change. So within Weber, we kind of sit at the intersection of communications and change management, management consulting, and our sort of focus is on moving people to move business. And what we mean by that is that change can't happen if you don't bring the humans along for the journey. So we see in a lot of things that we do, we work on a lot of big transformations. And by that, I mean anything from a restructuring of a company, a leadership transition, an M&A, or another kind of transaction like that. And there's often a big push to work on the nuts and bolts of the change, right? From the time you announce it to getting all the systems and processes in place to make that change happen. But at the end of the day, a lot of those changes fail, and in large part due to people not coming along for the journey. So, you pointed out that we can have all the technology, we can have systems change, but if the people who are at the heart of it, the people who are at the heart of a company and delivering on its strategy haven't come along for that journey, then there's no chance of success. So what we really focus on, it's not to say, a lot of times we're working alongside other consulting firms with clients who, like a Accenture, McKinsey, or Deloitte, who are working on that systems change. And we are in there talking about, okay, who are the stakeholders that this is really going to impact? Largely inside organizations, but increasingly also outside organizations. How are they going to react, and what do we need to do to really inspire them to see both the case for change and the vision for the future? So that's kind of our, it's not that we're not paying attention to the other stuff, but that we believe that to make change happen, we've got to bring the people along for the ride.
Yeah, it's surprising, even at this point in the kind of progress or progression of our, system here. We've been through all kinds of M&A situations. We've been up and down in the economy. We've had, countless transactions over decades and decades. And yet that one little kernel of truth that, the humans involved in the transition are kind of important, seems to still escape the minds of the architects of these transitions.
Yeah.
And, maybe it's because it's share price driven. I don't know. There's so many different reasons, but, why do you think that is? And, clearly you're in that space. You're making people aware of it, but, why has that happened?
It's interesting because in the roles that I've had, I've been both a consultant and also have in the CEO of United Minds. So that's given me a new lens, being part of an organization that has gone through rounds of change as well. Yeah. Which has given me a new appreciation. When I was younger and just consulting, you'd say, why doesn't anybody see this? But I think one thing that happens when a company is going through a lot of change, and even now we're seeing one of the things we're focusing on a lot these days is how to lead through the squeeze, as it's such a challenging time at the moment, and leaders have so many things coming at them. It's very easy to get sucked into the day-to-day job, right? And to assume that everyone is where you are on what we like to call the change curve, right? So, a leader who's in it every day and working in the teams that are, working on an M&A or working on a restructuring, or they're in it. And, they're kind of probably going home at the end of the day exhausted by it all and thinking, well, surely everybody knows where we are in this process.
Yeah.
But they forget that they don't, necessarily forget, but maybe don't consider that not everyone has the same amount of information or has had as much time to process a change.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons, it's both timing and the demands on leaders' time today, along with like they're way progressed on the change curve and everyone else is sort of at step one. And I think that's just easy to forget.
Yeah. I mean, do you think it also has to do with the types of transformations these organizations are going through? Because like I've been through a few, both on the like communicating end where I could have used some help from United Minds in some cases, certainly for figuring out the best way to get all the stakeholders in line. Instead, I was doing it myself or with a small team, sometimes myself, because it's very highly confidential information. You can't share it out. So, but also I've been on the other end where, there's been difficult restructurings or reorganizations. And, I've been restructured out, once at least. And neither case is particularly enjoyable, to be honest. But each of those things is very different. Trying to get the attention of different people, like who knows what, who you don't know which executive to talk to because, well, are they in the know? Do they understand what's going on? And then you feel like you're monopolizing, or at least I do, because this is just my nature. Just like, I don't want to bother this person again. Even if it's mission critical, it's like, oh man, he doesn't want to hear from me. She doesn't want to hear from me. I'm going to have to make another appointment with the CCO. My God, Yeah. So there's so much going on in my anxiety-addled head, but the whole thing is these different types of transformations they have to have something to do with it. And, I'm sure you're seeing tons of different kinds of transformations in your world.
Yeah. I mean, I think that every kind of transformation has some unique challenges, but there's also a lot of consistency in what leaders need to do. So you're one of the things that happens often is that leaders tend not to communicate or they think they don't need to communicate if there's not new information to share. So a merger is a good example. At the beginning of that, there's very little you can say because the two organizations can't really talk to each other, right? And there's not a lot, when an announcement's made, there's a lot of work to get to close, and then you've got to get to post-close. So there's nothing to say. And a lot of people assume, there's nothing to say. Let's not put stuff out there that is just repeating what we've already said. But then just what you described, that sort of employees begin to fill the void with what they're speculating and the rumor mill. And so it's that sort of point. If you don't tell your story, somebody else will. And I think that's never more true than in a big transformation where, you as a leader may not want to go out and just repeat yourself and say the same stuff over. But even getting out there and listening and being present can quell a lot of those concerns, or at least let people know that there's no new information to share. I think that's something that's really consistent across any kind of change. Because at the end of the day, it's really about human behavior, right? And people don't like change. It's like we're wired to not like going through large scale change. And so figuring out what are those mechanisms and tactics that are going to help people work through that. And some of it is just being present, right? Being present and consistent.
Yeah. Just thinking about that whole idea of if you don't tell your narrative, if you don't tell your story, somebody else will. The idea of that nature abhors a vacuum, and so does talking and writing and media and everything else. Everybody abhors a vacuum. So you need to control what you can control and say what you can say. But the worst thing to do is to not say anything at all. And
exactly.
And I feel like I've always had to sell that, it's like seems like such second nature things to me, but it's always like one of those further down proof points in a plan. And and by the way, if you don't have a story, then somebody's going to tell it for you. And they're like, yeah. We kind of believe you, wordsmith guy.
I think that's true. But, we see in some high stakes situation with an M&A in particular that when that happens, the void also gets filled by in a high profile M&A outside voices that are influencing your employees, right? So, we've had a situation we worked on recently where to cut through that disinformation, misinformation, cacophony of voices, we put leaders directly in front of frontline employees to have a conversation with them, to give them the facts as they, the true facts, and have a dialogue. And that it's interesting because we talk a lot about technology and people ask, what are the new ways of communicating to employees, especially if you have a big organization, but still that sort of face-to-face, even if you don't have all the answers, can really go a long way to bringing people along. And I think it's really important. I think another thing that's important is the idea of creating a North Star, which you could also say seems self-evident, that when you're embarking on any big change, you want your CEO and the senior team to paint the picture of the future. So you want them to explain why the case for change. Why are we doing this? Because change is painful, and people aren't going to, move unless they understand there's a reason that we're doing it. It's not just a self-inflicted wound. We have to change in order to do what, and that's where that North Star comes in. And I always like the example of Chris Nassetta at, I think I say his name right, at Hilton, who talks very eloquently about how he managed the turnaround there and the importance of establishing a North Star early on. That as things got more painful, as they had to go through some layoffs, as you were talking about your own experience, as they've had to navigate difficult change, it created that like anchor. And when things were going well, it was the benchmark for how are we getting there. So that idea of both listening, creating consistent communications, and painting that picture of the North Star, I think are all things that are consistent no matter what kind of transformation or change. And even today, when we see CEOs and leadership teams trying to figure out how to navigate the complexities of a year when so much change, there's so much unpredictability, I think those things continue to hold true.
Yeah. That whole idea of a North Star is even more critical in these times of change. And one thing that I've seen leadership struggle with the whole concept of a North Star and a vision, is you'll have these meetings, or you'll start to kind of think about what's the vision for this thing, and the leader in question may get it. They may get it right, but if they need to be sort of, I suppose, handheld and walked along the path to where that is, what I found is that they say, "Wait, we have a vision. It's the company vision, right? It's our company. This is what we do. This is our our tagline, and here's our vision and our behaviors and the things that we tell our employees all the time. So everybody should know that, right? Well, and my approach was, now's a good time to remind them of those things, but you need a very specific vision for why you're doing the thing you're doing. It has to align with that vision. It's got to be can't be counter to that vision. So how do we create that North Star? And I think that a lot of leaders need either to be kind of maybe educated about this, or I think once they go through it, they get it. But they don't necessarily see the need if the company already has a strong vision or any vision.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's interesting because typically they have a vision, right? They're not for the change. And I think you make a really good point. There's a difference between the company vision broadly versus the vision for what they're trying to achieve by taking the organization through a great deal of sometimes painful change, right?
Yeah.
But they have a reason for doing it, right? There is a vision for if they're embarking on an M&A, or they're spinning something off, or that could be about focus, or an M&A is like entering a new market or broadening the footprint of the organization, or whatever it might be. There is a vision. I think where the communication team and leaders can come in to play is helping them understand that not everyone to get people to believe, they need to be brought along for that ride. And to do that, it's both simultaneously explaining why the status quo isn't going to work anymore, and saying what will things look like if we do this initiative well, if we do this M&A, if we restructure. We have to do it because we need to be more competitive. Well, why is that? And make the case for people, but you've got to paint the picture of where you're headed as well. And that's not necessarily the company vision broadly, right? It's it might be much more granular than that. And then I think it's repeating that over and over again, which is again the Hilton example. What I thought they did quite well is to make that the centerpiece for the reasons difficult changes are made, the reasons great things happen and are celebrated, that it all comes back to that. And I think communication professionals can really help. What we try to do is help leaders both understand why that sort of drumbeat is necessary and how you pull the content out of them. If they're, some CEOs that I've worked with get that intuitively right away. And they understand about creating a movement in an organization, what you need to do to make that happen. And they're asking us for it. Others are saying, why do we continue to get questions about why this is necessary? It seems self-evident. And they have that in their brain. It's pulling it out and turning it into something that can then appeal to anywhere, tens of thousands of employees. Like you're trying to move an organization that at many times is not only large, but far flung and represents different cultures. So, it's not a simple task.
Yeah, it seems that the communicator's role here is so central to, advising the CEO and just really helping them to understand that communication with your scattered, multicultural, global audience, or even your single factory in, suburban New Jersey or wherever it is, require different approaches. They all require that drumbeat. They require this kind of understanding that you're on this journey together. And sometimes just sending an email just doesn't cut it, ma'am, sir. And it's funny when they throw it back on the communicator. Well, you're supposed to write a better email then, but I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen. It's interesting. Look, I mean, we've been talking a little bit about, certain types of CEOs do this and certain types do this and leaders do this. I'd like to ground us a little bit here. Can we go back a couple of clicks? It's funny that this whole idea of go down 2 clicks or click into this a little bit more. I only heard that in agency speak. But anyway, let's take it up a couple levels. And we're talking about these different transformations. First of all, very practical level. What are the various types of transformations that you are seeing happening now? And if it's just like, hey, it's blatantly obvious what that is, great. But if there's a need to define any of them, give us a little context.
Sure. So it's interesting because we went into this year thinking there was going to be, with a lot of predictions about an uptick in M&A. We've had a few years where we do a lot of M&A work, but a few years where it's been quieter. Not that there hasn't been any, but it's been quieter. And the predictions were this year that would take off, and there would be a lot of there's money ready to go to do it. Companies were sort of primed, and then obviously we faced a great degree of uncertainty, and CEOs are saying they're just not ready to make those kind of moves at the moment. Yeah. There's some, but it's much less than what we thought. In fact, we have a partnership with S&P, and they were saying January was the sort of lowest activity month. I don't remember, and it was like at least a couple of years. So we came into this year thinking like this is going to be the year of the M&A, and there's certainly some of them, but it's not to that degree.
I should just interject a little bit. People will be listening to this at different times, so I just want to let everybody know that we're recording this, at mid and end of April 2025. That's all I will say. Google that date. You'll see the chaos going
on their plate, right?
And I'm sure by the time this comes out, it will still be somewhat, if not completely, a totally chaotic economic environment. But let's just leave that there. And so you're saying that M&A traffic or M&A, the demand for M&A has
is
been
one category. It's not been as, and it could pick up.
Lower.
The money was there to start it. The conditions were there. We could see that begin to pick up later in the year. Another one is spinoffs. We worked with the company last year that was spinning off one of its businesses, and those are always really interesting from a communication standpoint, because you're kind of we talked about before, the story, the case for change, and the vision. You're doing that for two different entities. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we've worked on both sides. The company where that's divesting the asset, and for the new company. And the other thing that's exciting about that is there's often a branding element, and you're creating the whole thing from scratch, which can be really exciting and fun. So that's sort of one, the M&A, the spinoff. We also see a lot of restructuring. So I would say in the last couple of years, that's more of the large scale change we've seen, is our companies restructuring. And that might be outsourcing, reorganizing around a different strategy. And there's a lot of having to lay people off and restructure. Those are always very complex. They maybe have not quite as many of the M&A is fun to work on because it brings everything. It's like the vision, the brand, bringing two cultures together. Restructuring tends to be a little bit more insular, depending on what it is, that it's inside the wall of the company, unless it's something that's really causing a lot of layoffs or what have you. But those are very complex as well.
I mean, does restructuring always go hand in hand with layoffs? I mean, sometimes, not always. Yeah.
Often. There's one I've been advising on that's looking to outsource. They have to become leaner and more efficient. And those are always really tricky and complex situations. Anytime you have people impacted like that, the question is, how do you do that in the most authentic, transparent way that's consistent with your values and respects the people who are leaving and the people who are staying? Yeah. But there are certainly cases where there's restructuring with not, with minimal layoffs. We also see leadership transition, which is often fun to work on. There, as you probably know, the turnover rate or the longevity of a CEO is shorter than it used to be. And I would also say the ramp up time. We used to say, remember the 100-day plan, and then it was all sort of built out that way. And I don't think leaders today have the luxury of that kind of being able to take a year of a honeymoon period, especially now. They're dealing with things coming at them right and left. And so, the challenge there is helping a new CEO on board get the right information quickly, understand the organization, and be able to start coming out with a point of view. And that's always fun to work on as well. Yeah.
Now, a lot of these transactions that we hear about, and certainly M&A, anything that has a strong media element that requires these, huge preparations and big programs, people automatically jump to or think about, we're talking about enterprises. We're talking about large companies, companies with, let's say, anywhere from a couple thousand employees on up, right? And I think, heard yesterday, the number, I heard 99% of all businesses in the US are small businesses under, they call it under 10 million or something. I think that's the category. It's hard to conceptualize for most people, I think, what that means. And the kinds of things that you're talking about, these, transition and transformation, happens at all levels. And, maybe an M&A would be a lot less complex if you're talking about one LLC buying a one-person LLC. That's different. But when you have employees involved at any number, or when you have different systems or different, it's just a matter of scale. So, thinking about that it is relevant, I think, across the different ethnographics, psychographics, biznographics. What do you call them? Firmographics. Thank you, Jake. Firmographics. Different types of companies. What are the commonalities that you see? Like let's just look at leadership behaviors, right? So like, what are the commonalities that you see across, or maybe just the archetypical leadership behaviors that communicators need to deal with across all these different M&As, or all these different transformations?
Yeah. I think actually the behaviors are often quite similar. What I think it's kind of fun working with smaller organizations because, especially if I always thought there would be a really interesting for pre-IPO and immediately post-IPO companies tend not to have focused as much on the leadership infrastructure and the communication infrastructure to do that really well. That's not across the board, but in general, we don't tend to work as they're very focused on the IPO itself and not so much like how are we building out the
internally, are they more focused on product, and like is that where they're
I think getting to the IPO. I mean, you see some PE firms, and we've worked with a couple who are like want to up level the leadership skills of their portfolio companies, and that's exciting work. But I think what's interesting about companies in an earlier phase like that is they maybe don't have all the the tools or the approaches for this, and that you can really see an impact in the work you're doing, right? And all the things we've just talked about. I think the behaviors themselves, again, it sort of goes back to that universal, what does it take to change human behavior? And any example in organization, some of the best CEOs I've seen are in smaller organizations where they, create an incredible following of people who believe, Patagonia is always cited, and they're not so small now, but they, that how they created that culture and the North Star and the like, I think is really powerful. So I think the same behaviors are there. It's sometimes fun to work with those companies because you can see the impact of the change when you make recommendations as a communication or a change management professional. You see the impact of it more quickly.
I can see that. I mean, having been mostly for large companies when I was in-house, it's change is slow. Change takes a while. Impact is, it's the brontosaurus tail. You smack it, and who knows? A couple months later,
and I think that's one of the things we've been thinking a lot about is in the world of change management, how do we create more agile approaches to doing it? And I also think that's where AI can come in to help.
Oh, for sure.
We've used AI, for instance. A really important thing is understanding where all your internal, what everybody's thinking in different parts of the organization. And we've used AI to take lots of data from different parts of the organization and very quickly assess how the change is hitting and what the major issues are. And that's something that would have taken us, a couple of weeks to sort through. And now we can feed in, if we have that kind of input, we can feed it in and really understand, like, okay, over here, this group, there's a lot of questions about this. So I think that idea of being more agile, even in a big organization, to your point, where change is harder to pivot on a dime.
Yeah, I do want to get back to the AI thing because, that's my thing. And I love talking about AI. My voice is a little hoarse today because last night I was talking about AI. However,
so much.
But, and this might be a first for the show, that I'm more interested to talk about something else besides AI in a particular statement. And it was this point, becoming more agile and, figuring out ways to speed up transformation. Clearly, people want, audiences, your employee audience, your executive, your stakeholder audiences, all of them. You want things to get done and over with, right? But if we're looking at things from a human-centric approach, and maybe as part of this, you can kind of double back a little bit and highlight some of the qualities of what it means to be human-centric. But as part of a human-centric approach, does that conflict with speeding things up sometimes? Like, is there an inherent contradiction there?
Yeah.
I don't know if I don't know if there is. I just want to know, because I know people take time as much as everybody's different. I will adopt new technologies in a femtosecond, with a blink of an eye. I know people who are far more capable than me in certain areas of communications who take ages or may never ever look at a technology because, it's just not in their zone. They're not interested. They want to do their job a different, whatever it is. Doesn't matter what the benefits are. But I'm fast. They're slow in that. I take forever to write something. Somebody else does it in 30 seconds. It's just like a thing. But when it comes to adjusting to, I guess, a paradigm shift or culture shift or hey, these were your behaviors yesterday. And now as part of the new co, we're going to add these two to it. Or you have to exhibit these behaviors or the culture is changing in this way. And yes, I know that you were living in one culture yesterday. This is the new culture. It's kind of like getting on a plane and going from the US to Japan and understanding, all right, I was in this culture. Well, now I'm in this culture. I have to behave this way. But one of them is my home culture and one of them isn't.
Yeah.
And it must make for some very interesting dynamics. So speeding that whole process up doesn't always sound like it's precisely human-centric. So just thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. And I think that you're right. People go through the change. We have a slide that's got the change curve. People think of the change curve as this one traditional line, but when you think of an organization, it's multiple versions of that line together because people don't go through it in different parts of the organization. They go through it at different pace, different stakeholder groups. And I think that's one thing communicators, when I started in this, would think of employees as just one big mass of people, right? It'd be like, even in the aftermath, they'd have the communication announcement plan for an M&A, and then somebody would be like, what should we say to employees writ large? And I think to your point, you've really got to look at employees as a very diverse. I mean, sometimes you can have 400,000 people in an organization, and they're all going to have very different views depending on where they sit. So I think in terms of speeding things up, people have to have time to process. And you're absolutely right about that. I think where technology can help is sort of engaging people in ways faster. And, one of the things I talked about before was listening and understanding what those different stakeholder groups think. So if we can pinpoint faster, where are people stuck or what are the questions and get on top of that sooner, it's going to help people process through the change faster. I think another thing we're doing, we haven't talked, another kind of change we do a lot of work on is culture transformation. And we've got a client we're talking to right now their goal is to try to facilitate this culture transformation and really get people's voices involved because, the more people feel like they've had a voice or they've had some fingerprint on the process, the more they feel bought in and it can speed the change up, right? So they're looking at how can we use technology to engage 150,000 people in what we're looking at for our new culture framework. And that's really exciting. I mean, we've always had versions of that. You had IBM's Values Jam many, many, many years ago, right? But today that process is like, how do we use technology to facilitate that kind of dialogue with that number of employees and distill the themes out of it quickly so that we can move faster. And I think that's really exciting. Yes. It's not that people are processing faster, but that our ability to engage them in a meaningful and more targeted way that's stakeholder centric, even inside the organization, I think is where we want to lean into AI and technology.
Yeah, I suppose so. You can speed up some of the processes and the supporting infrastructure that helps the transition along and kind of clear some of the noise away from people's heads so they're freer to focus and think about getting accultured, about what this new thing means to me in my life. As you're talking, I can't help it. I just kind of start thinking of use cases for AI. Like, okay.
Well, I think one thing that's been interesting is like, it's harder to, the use of it internally is like, there's things that we've done to understand stakeholder groups in terms of narrative intelligence. We have a great team here at Weber Shandwick that does cutting edge work on that. And we use that too when we're working on an M&A to understand the external voices that are influencing employees inside. It's been a little trickier to figure out how do we use it inside organizations. Because if we're looking at data, there's privacy issues, there's issues around how you're using that kind of data. But we are finding ways to use it to really speed up the work that we do. And not just speed it up, but engage bigger swaths of people in a more engaging, a more consistent way in giving their input and thoughts.
Yeah, it sort of ties together something you said earlier about looking at these employee audiences as just so diverse and varied. And term that comes to mind for me is fractured, because that's what I've been saying about the entire audience landscape right now for all of us as communicators, the challenge, and marketers, the challenge that we have to absolutely understand and accept is that the audience is fractured and you're not going to reach them the same way you used to before. And, for the most part, I think people understand that, but it's rarely is that lens kind of flipped around and focused in on an employee public. And my friend Ethan McCarty always calls it our friend Ethan always calls it like having employees as a public. And
I've heard him say that, and that's a good way to think about it.
Great way to think about it.
Yeah.
And you're dealing with essentially a fractured group of people, and the larger that employee base is, clearly the more fracturing it is. So, I have been an advocate, I believe, and I've actually practiced, put my money where my mouth is, or my mouth where my money. I don't know that you can skillfully understand and use AI tools to better adjust your messaging for those different audiences in a better and faster and more effective way. But I was just thinking about just pulling survey information and being able to talk to people and getting their verbatims. You don't have to sit and fuss with these big long spreadsheets. Take 3 weeks to figure out what employees think about their new seats, or did the CEO's vision make sense to you? I mean, anything.
Exactly. And you have to have that input. So we had a client last year where it was in Europe. They have a period when you're doing any kind of restructuring where employees have an opportunity to submit questions. Oh yeah. Right. And so we were able to train a tool. The first time out, it maybe didn't do what we needed it to do, but we were able, and this going to be a rinse and repeat process. So we could track sentiment over time to train the tool to really pull and target sort of where the issues, what are the big questions. And that's, I think, a huge opportunity in change management, to your point, to really distill and arm leaders with who wouldn't want to know that? Where are the sticking points? What's going to hang us up? Another thing we talk a lot about is how powerful employee voice is. And we actually wrote a study back in 2014. It was the first study on employee advocacy, this notion of, we started off saying, it seems a little naive now, employees can be a great voice for your brand and they're on social media. And it is true. That's all true. But the next study we did in 2017 was there's a flip side to that. And it's about employee advocacy, the dark side of it. And we've seen that if employees don't agree, what a vocal body that, population they can be in an M&A situation or anything else. So for us to be able to understand using AI and using these tools, where are we seeing hotspots is an incredibly powerful thing. And both inside and looking at using it outside to look at places where employees comment and kind of sense where do we see these issues?
There's massive amounts of data available, I think, for the data scientists who are looking around. For us mere mortals who only have ChatGPT or whatever our internal kind of our generative AI stuff, though, I absolutely think that there are huge cases, huge ways to be using these tools to really to move all of this forward. As you were talking about it, I was thinking about this idea of, so you have all these surveys, you're pulling in all this data, you're getting all the kind of information from the employees, taking that and then manufacturing their kind of folding that into your normal corporate talking points and the kind of, using it to make adjustments to the strategy. My mind was going in all these places, but actually where where I kind of like perked up or perked down a little bit, maybe, was this whole thing about employee advocacy, right? Because like all of these things, all this data can feed into that. You can understand your employees better and give them the better information to share, or just kind of understand, hey, some of these people, this group is not a sharing group. This group is a sharing group. Like, you have better intel about their behaviors, which sounds a little spooky, but you can. But the thing that really got me, and now I remember, was the follow-up to your employee advocacy study where there was the dark side. I think a lot of people missed that one. Like, I feel like,
well, they may not have read the report, but they felt it elsewhere. I mean, there's,
I just feel like people even now, I mean, as recently as, I don't know, like my most recent role, like you're talking about employee advocacy, getting them, like, we got to get our employees to share stuff on LinkedIn. We got to get them to do this. And we've been saying the same thing for LinkedIn's been around 22 years. We've been saying the same thing for at least 10 of those.
Yeah.
And having that kind of foundational data to begin with, to understand where you're able to push before you go there, that would be priceless. I don't know if it's exactly legal in all countries, but
yeah. And it's a tricky balance, right? Because again, like we see in a lot of deal situations that employees have a voice and they may not agree with what you're doing, and that can be a huge disruptor, depending on what it is. But again, it's about trying to understand that sentiment and doing that stakeholder analysis and having the data available to make those smart decisions and know where your hotspots are going to be.
I mean, if nothing else, there's no longer an excuse to not be better prepared for all these things.
Right.
With what you have available to you, I don't think you can go into an engagement or be an in-house comms person or whatever your role is and argue that, well, hey, I didn't know how this would, I didn't know how this would affect the audience, or I didn't know how this messaging would feel, or I didn't you can make far more reasonable kind of judgments because you have great tools available to you. And let me give you an example. And this gets back to to transitional change and management. Believe me, you're talking about how the flip side of employee advocacy, and it just made me remember. I've been playing around a lot, as my listeners know, with Notebook LM. It's my very favorite thing for a lot of reasons. But I know my generalist communications skill set. Like I'm self-aware, and I know that there are certain areas that I've never been really thrilled to do. I do them anyway when asked, and there are certain areas that, like I said, there's a billion people who could do it better than I can. There are some things that I know that I'm stellar at, but looking at, let's say, crisis, for example. Now, I can handle crisis communications. I can't handle crisis communications as well as, I don't know, dozens of people that I worked alongside in crisis situations. I've learned from them, but I know that I need to kind of rely on them. My point is, I created a crisis communications base camp within, Notebook LM as an AI research tool for myself, because it's not like I'm having crises or anything, but I want to be able to at least give the surface level to my clients so that, I can go this far, and then you need to bring in, the lawyers. It's amazing how some of the reservations I had about crisis, I was able to kind of dismiss, because it's the speed of absorbing information and kind of making sense of the various messaging that's going around. Now, the reason this kind of came to mind is because the simulation that I started with was that almost the exact thing that you talked about, which is, your company has made some kind of a reorg, and a very vocal employee has taken to social media and trashed you. I made up some story, and here's what they said, and blah, 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 right? And gave it all kinds of context. And then it gave me a response plan, even, kind of took a shot at holding statements, initial media response, all these great things that would have taken me so long to create myself. And they were good because I used the right sources for the material. Like I used just the right stuff, the crisis experts that I know. I used their knowledge in their material to advise me. So, the whole point of all this, I think, is that A, AI is awesome, but B, employees really, as a public, employees as a fractured audience, are critical to the success of any transition and any transformation, and are also one of the biggest risks you have to any transformation.
Yeah.
And for that reason, putting them at the center, right? That human-centric approach is making more and more and more and more sense, right? And is that human-centric approach, right? Is that about prioritization? Is it about messaging? Is it about timing? In other words, you tell them first before you tell other people. Like, what does it look like?
I think it has to be stakeholder driven, and figuring out it's going to be different for every part of the organization based on what you're trying to do. You could be doing a change that's really only going to affect majorly one part of the organization, and so I think it differs in every case, just like crisis work can differ in every case. And it's interesting you talk about your the toolbox, or I can't
my base
remember what
camp.
you call it, your base camp.
Yeah.
Because I started creating a modern change management playbook. There's lots of different approaches to change management out there, ProSci and other things that some of your listeners will know about. But what I think we're really trying to do is a modern version of a change playbook that can be more agile and stakeholder centric. Not that any change management plan is focused on moving people along a continuum, but I think today things are moving so quickly. We have to create something that can help organizations be more agile with it. And interestingly, I actually started building it using AI. And to your point, I was prompting it to do certain things, like how would we, what change skills are going to be needed in the future, and sort of it was spit out some really interesting stuff that I'm excited about. We're working on developing sort of a change playbook that could help organizations like your base camp really navigate and create, because it's not a one size fits all. It depends on the change. It depends on the employee base, who's being affected, what you're trying to accomplish with them. But the playbook would help you sort of work through that and test and learn. An approach is around, is this message working? Are we moving the stakeholder group? Who else is going to be worried about this in the next 3 months? So I think we want to both help equip companies. Obviously, we love consulting with our clients. We want to do more of that, but there's also sort of a need for like this methodology and approach, like your crisis base camp, that would help people sort of get their head around it.
I mean, again, to me, it's like partly it's because I always say I'm fundamentally lazy and I want to create shortcuts to things. So I don't want to have to go, I don't have to go and like read a book about crisis. Who wants to do that? I don't want to go like research.
Yeah,
just have it all in one place.
Base camp. Exactly. That's the same idea of what we're trying to create.
Yeah. But it's it turns out that, hey, it's an incredible validation tool, and it actually spurs me to learn more. I'm always tongue in cheek about the whole laziness thing, but I am looking for faster, shorter, quicker ways to do stuff. And the idea of building out a crisis playbook sounds amazing to me. A change management playbook sounds amazing to me because it's I don't think it's a very well understood term. I mean, I don't think people understand that there's change, that it needs to be managed, but like that there's a whole discipline around that is kind of, I don't know, alien to, I think, a lot of folks out there who aren't in it, like who aren't in the worlds that we live in.
I think that's right. I mean, if you think about it, its most simple terms, it's really about creating a movement in an organization, right? So it's like a lot of the psychology that you think about when you're doing a political campaign or bringing people along for any sort of major journey.
Yeah.
Looking at the future, it's using a lot of those same tactics, but
Yeah.
organizations aren't inherently democratic, right? So
Oh, yeah.
historically, they haven't always had to think about how are we bringing everybody along.
Yeah.
The best CEOs, I think, have, but and
Yeah.
I think today it's really a requirement because of what we were talking about, employee advocacy and activism. And I think communicators, your audience, have a really big role in that. In fact, we had a client last week ask us, "Do you think you could build us a change playbook?" And it was the comms team. I think the comms team ends up sitting often at the center of these things because they come to it with maybe less of they're the convener of everybody, right? So it's like you've got a lot of different folks who are they're working on one piece of the puzzle, and the comms team's trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah.
And bring it together.
It's
so
the
I
source
think they have
of
an important role to play.
Yeah, it's the source of both like value and fear for an organization. Like that the comms team is just like the nerve center, hey, those folks know something about everything, and they're putting it all together and helping us tell our story. And certainly, if you need to know something, hey, let's talk to the comms team because they really can they'll get to the right people, blah, blah, blah. And then, those people who know everything, the comms team, my God, they know everything. Geez, isn't that like, what do we do about them? It sort of starts to flip in the other direction, and I was reading about, I think it was in, it was Dr. Laura McHale. She's a neuroscientist and communicator. She used to be the head of internal comms for Deutsche, I think, in Asia. And she went on to become a neuroscientist and consultant for communicators. She wrote this great book called Neuroscience for Communications Leadership. And I think in the beginning of the book, and forgive me, Laura, if I'm getting this wrong, but she talks about how comms is in this sort of unique place, and we often share the fate of the CEO because we're highly trusted. We kind of stake our effectiveness and our career on our capability to build relationships and trust with the leadership. And if we go too far, we build that leadership trust with a CEO. Next CEO comes in, that can be problematic. We're too aligned. And I imagine that's part of it's part of transformation that you might deal with. I mean, especially when you have two organizations coming together and you've got different CEOs and different comms teams, have you ever seen that kind of or had to manage through that sort of a conflict where there's a suspicion and trust issue across with these different teams, with new CEOs, et cetera?
Yeah. I mean, yes, both. And if you think of an M&A, there's two teams. Yeah. So you're always going to have and to your point, there's often an alignment. It's the kind of role. And it's actually interesting because we're doing a qualitative study right now. It's the second of a series that we're doing on the CCAO, Chief Corporate Affairs Officer role, and what's on their mind today. And how the role is broadened to become really what we were talking about, that sort of glue and really a business having to get much more involved in understanding the business. I think that because, to your point, you get so involved with a leadership team, it can make it, when there is a new leadership team after an M&A happens, that CEO is really going to pick the person to play that role.
Oh, for sure.
And I think that happens in leadership transition as well. Yeah. So we're often, in a lot of cases, we also counsel communication leaders and their teams on what their role is post the change, and how they might need to rethink their team and their strategy to either support a new CEO. So it's an interesting, to your point, it's a unique position because of the closeness and the sort of the counsel provided specifically on the CEO and the CEO's agenda.
It's such a tricky game, isn't it? You've got this, especially in a merger or an acquisition, where the acquiring company has essentially the leverage, and the comms team of the acquisition of the, what do they call it?
the acquiree.
The acquiree, yeah.
Yeah.
You know that this is going to be a 6, 8, 10, 14, 16 month process. And if you have any reasonable level of wisdom, you know that at the end of that process, there's a very good chance that you will be out of a job. And that either becomes a fight or flight thing. You're either going to, try extremely hard to prove value in positive ways, see how it goes. Or you're going to do your best to get the hell out of that organization and hopefully not sabotage the place that you're in on the way out, which is always dangerous. And it's, I suppose on smaller teams is probably worse, but the intricacy there, and where do you go from there? And then you have to be the people all along the way who are responsible,
who are supporting you don't
change.
Know your fate yourself. I have a friend, colleague, client. She's sort of been all those things, who has worked on a lot of companies who have done major transitions that have ultimately ended up with her leaving the role. And I actually think it's interesting when I think about the complexity she has navigated and what that has brought, the skill set she has, which is quite unique.
Amazing
to have gone through, multiple transformations, be it a spin or a merger or a restructuring that she's had to manage and then move on. I think it's quite a unique skill set.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And it certainly takes a lot of tolerance of, uncertainty and high stakes. Because, when we're working on an M&A, I mean, it's just the level of activity. It's like working on a crisis, right?
Yeah.
So if you go from job to job and you're doing that, you've got to be up for that kind of intensity on an ongoing
the whole time.
basis. But
yeah. And if you are on the comms team, especially, you're trying to figure out how to message all of these things into the rest of the employees and create the messaging for the executives and figure out what you're going to say to the media if they ask, and then understand, at the end of this whole process, I'm out of a job, but this is going to be good for me. Maybe I can negotiate an exit. No, I don't think I'll be able to negotiate an exit because I'm not supposed to know all these things yet. Like, it's this whole thing that, imagine the pressure and the stress that causes the communicator. It takes a rare breed, I think, to not only survive that, but to really thrive in it and say, at the end of it all, hey, look, I know the situation. I've delivered this incredible work for you, and I will continue to do so if you ask me. But I realize you don't need two of me. So,
I mean, in many ways, it's like the crisis work you're describing, because they're operating at that level constantly, but without a real line of sight. That's really only mostly true when you're doing an M&A. Even in a lot of CEO transitions, certainly CEOs bring in their own communication people sometimes, but I've also seen a lot of teams stay and onboard the CEO and manage through that.
There's always a little bit of fear and anxiety management, any of those things.
But that's where at the beginning of the conversation, I said to you, M&A has it all, right? You're doing, leadership positioning, the North Star, the new, potentially branding of the company. You're doing, it's kind of got everything. We often are helping stand up a new communication team and navigate and set their strategy to support the new organization. So it kind of they're fun to work on because it's everything, everywhere, all at once.
I've been on a couple of those projects, and I've thoroughly enjoyed them. I wish in some ways that I was more involved in one of them and less involved in another. But they are really fun. They're intense but fun, and you come out of it with a work product that you're like, you look back on and you can actually, even if you can never ever show it to a soul, like you can never show it to anybody, but who cares? It's so good. We have covered so much ground, and there's so much ground I still want to cover. I didn't even talk to you about, I was so curious about how generational differences affect transformation. And I was like, because I've been talking about that a lot lately, but I'm going to put a pin in that one and ask you to maybe come back again to talk about that. But in the meantime, any last words, anything that, to sum it all up, any kind of, big points or takeaways that you'd like to to give to our audience. I always kind of do this as a hey, what's keeping you up at night type of question. And if you could answer it that way if you'd like, but I'm going to make this player's choice. If you'd like to, anything you'd like to kind of give us on the way out so that,
I think
some takeaways.
Yeah. Sure. I think one thing that's I'm going to answer that one first because something comes to mind very quickly that I think communicators could really be thinking about that I've been thinking a lot about is the next generation of leadership in all of this. And when you talk about the convergence of AI, hybrid work, all of these things, what does that mean? And we've talked a lot about the role of leadership in change and transformation. And it's like the next generation of leaders who are going to be running organizations that are not, I know, right now we have a lot of legacy leaders pushing for people to be back in the office for all these things. But when you think about 10 years from now, what is it going to look like to lead a large global organization? Those leaders won't be in their jobs anymore. It's the people who are, millennials and Gen Z who are going to be, they've grown largely come into the workforce when it has been remote and when, it's been harder to build culture and do all these things. And AI will advance and other technologies will come along. And I think there's like a code to crack on what does leadership look like in that environment? And it's probably going to be that generation to figure it out.
God help us.
So that's kind of, to me, not that we don't have any,
we're
input, I have thoughts on it, but,
great.
I think that's a really interesting challenge to think about because right now I feel like we're at this tail end of like the more traditional way of doing things. And you've got to be back in the office I just don't think that's going to last forever. Yeah. And so what does it look like to be a leader 10 years from now?
That would keep me up too. In fact, now it will.
Sorry about that.
No. I mean, it's interesting how like to me, the question that then pops up in the sub question again, I'll say this for another time, but just to put in your head is, okay, fine. They'll be our leaders in 10 years, but what do you do about the skill atrophy that is happening because they're using various tools to take care of what they would normally have taken care of as humans, and the wisdom that you gain from either cranking out written documents and writing reports or doing research, no matter what your role is, that now that's made fast and easy by AI, for better, for worse. Your skills are not going to be as sharp at 10 years as somebody who's been doing that by hand for 10 years. So
unless you're,
in different ways.
I'm not certainly not an expert, but unless you become so good at writing prompts that's the skill now. Is right.
And that's the question. That's the thing, isn't it? Like, well, maybe those aren't the right skills. Then maybe there's just a different set of skills, and we just don't know. I mean,
it's like any other revolution, the Industrial Revolution, it's like, can we picture what that is? And I don't even know that we're there that we can picture that for the next
I don't think anybody knows, and if they do, they're trying to sell books.
I think a worthy cause.
A worthy cause. So look, this has been awesome. I think that you've given us a lot of things to think about. Transformational change is so critical. And it's really that the whole point about being human-centric has to, I think, play out in every level of our professional lives. And I won't, certainly in our personal lives, but don't blame me for having being value driven or making value judgments about that. I'll just say for professionally, putting humans first. Some companies have been blowing it lately, in my opinion, and I'm sure in yours too. Human-centric, we have to continue that way, no matter whether you're talking about a very simple AI task, writing a LinkedIn post, or all the way up through, how you run a change comms program, and how you address your employee audiences. I so want to talk about this more, but for now, I will just say to everybody, if you want to learn more about Kate, check her out on LinkedIn, Kate Bullinger. Her name will be spelled properly in the episode title. And go to unitedmindsglobal.com. Unitedmindsglobal.com. That's where you'll find all the information.
We're just relaunching our website. So we're
terrific. So just in time.
And just in time.
Yeah. And I'm sure that you can navigate to United Minds from the Weber Shandwick properties, but go to unitedmindsglobal.com. check out Kate on LinkedIn. Any place else people can find you, Kate, that you tend to be active professionally and want people to know about?
Those are the two best ones on
Yeah.
LinkedIn. But those are great. And you can always reach me through United Minds Global. Be
on the lookout for Kate at speaking engagements, watch your local conferences, et cetera, to see if she's on the stage. I would go. But definitely reach out to Kate if you have any questions about her or about transformational change. Thank you so much, Kate. It has been amazing. Thank you. It was such a pleasure. I've had a great time. This is awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks for taking the time to listen in on today's conversation. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to subscribe through the podcast player of your choice, share with your friends and colleagues, and leave me a review. 5 stars would be preferred, but it's up to you. Do you have ideas for future guests or you want to be on the show? Let me know at dan@trendingcommunicator.com. Thanks again for listening to the Trending Communicator.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Robbie Samuels hosts the On the Schmooze podcast. Robbie, tell listeners what to expect from the show.
Since 2015, I've interviewed entrepreneurs who overcame challenges to achieve success in their field or industry. Tune in to On the Schmooze to listen as I ask deep questions to elicit untold stories about leadership and networking.
And where can people subscribe?
Find the show at ontheschmooze.com or on marketingpodcast.net, or just search for it wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard them. Go subscribe. This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.